Hi, Siobhan, you can start now.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Siobhan Thompson. A warm South African welcome to you to our first session for 2021, the Insider Sessions. And today we're going to be discussing how is climate changing wine. Firstly, I'd just like to also introduce some of my fellow Wines of South Africa employees. Sarah's on the line, and we have Joe, and we also have Thelma. And then just some quick admin that we need to do. Thank you very much to Westgrove for sponsoring the sessions. We have 3 sessions. Without them, we wouldn't be able to run this, so their support is greatly appreciated. And then just quickly, I need to share with you some information on the Cape Export Network. Waiting for the slide to come up. So the Cape Export Network is an outcome of collective response to the pandemic. With travel bans, the rise of virtual meetings, focus on digital, this has provided South African wine industry with the opportunity to create a portal dedicated to South African wines, built to help expose importers to more South African wines. This is the only business-to-business marketplace dedicated to South African wines, and the concept has been tested with importers globally and will continue to evolve. There's also a technical team available to support producers and to focus strongly on marketing of this portal. So if anybody is interested in hooking up on the portal, you can go to www.capeexportnetwork.co.za. So I'll just repeat that, capeexportnetwork.co.za. So not to take up any more time, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's just going to do some introductions. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Before I introduce Job, just to say that we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of the session. It's only about 10 minutes, so we might not get around to everyone's question, but we'll try and answer as many of them as possible, and we'll also try and answer some of them via email. We're very happy to have Job as our chairperson for today. Good morning, Job. Welcome. Job is the 3rd Dutch Master of Wine. As you can hear, we don't have many of them, so we're very proud of him. Job, for his research paper, developed an online support system that forecasts fungal infections in vineyards, making it possible for a producer to reduce the amount of fungicides needed, which is a great improvement on the side of sustainability. Job has a long-standing and close relationship with South Africa, coming from his position as a buyer for the Legionnaire Group, but also time that he spent in South Africa on trade visits, harvesting. So he knows South Africa very well, and we're very lucky to have him as an ambassador and supporter of South Africa in the Dutch market. Thank you, Job, and thank you for the time you've taken to prepare for today. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for this kind introduction. A special welcome to all the viewers that joined this webinar today. And the hot topic of today is, of course, climate change, which is quite literally a hot topic. It's also a very broad and complex topic that we're going to discuss. Climate change is a global phenomenon, but its implications vary considerably per region. That's why I'm very pleased and also privileged to be joined by 4 fabulous panelists, I must say, from South Africa, and discuss climate change in their country, each from their own fields of expertise. After I shortly introduce each panelist, and we agreed on calling each other by our first names, I will provide you with an overview of what to expect for this insider session that will last for 1.5 hours. But first I want to introduce Rosa Kruger, Grand Lady, or should I say mevrouw in Afrikaans or Dutch, of the Cape Old Vines. Vineyard manager extraordinaire. Are there vineyards in South Africa she is not familiar with? Maybe not. She is described as a passionate professional with a no-nonsense approach. She is also internationally known as initiator of the Old Vine project in 2002, which officially launched in 2016. I'm very happy to have you in my panel. Next up is Eben Sadi, a very well-known artisanal producer under the name of Sadi Family Wines and pioneer of world-class Mediterranean blends from the Swartland since 2000 onwards. Columella and Palladius have established a wide reputation in the world at this stage. 12 years later, he started with the Oude Vineyard or Old Vine series in English, with 8 single vineyard wines that showcase great individuality. He is known as an innovator, perfectionist, and winner of the prestigious Winemaker Award of the Institute of Masters of Wine. Never short of an opinion, so we have something to look forward to. Then we have Carl Schulz, an accomplished winemaker with no less than 28 consecutive vintages as Hartenberg Estate in Stellenbosch, Bottelerij Hills, with a specialization in Shiraz. He is known as a critical thinker with a great commitment to environmentally friendly practices and sustainability. Carl is a respected member and past chairman of the respected Cape Winemakers Guilds, really a force to be reckoned with in South Africa. Finally, we have Konrad Schutte, internationally trained vineyard consultant, management consultant for VinPro, which is an industry-funded body that represents and consults to over its 2,000 stakeholders in South African wine. He is head of a top-notch team of viticulturalists that have their feet on the ground to support growers and wineries all over the Western Cape. Now, before we're going to start, I have a very short presentation to share with you to set the stage for the discussion. And I hope everybody can see it now, clearly on their screen. So the topic of today is how is climate change changing wine? I hope we can go to the next sheet. I think I have to go. Yeah, this way. So what can you expect today? An insider session on the implications of climate change in South Africa over the last 20 plus years. And we have special attention to the 3 years drought period of 2016 to 18. We're going to discuss the short-term adaptation techniques, such as vineyard management, soil work that can be done, canopy management, but also the long-term strategies of maybe new vineyard design and rootstock and grape selections that can be implemented to adapt to the change by growers and wineries alike. Of course, we're going to discuss sustainability, but for a more detailed discussion on this topic, I really warmly recommend the insider session hosted by Jamie Good of last year, which really focused on sustainability as such. What is outside the scope of this discussion today, because we have only 1.5 hours, is the exact science of climate change and what scenarios will be held for the future globally, and some political views how to solve this issue on short notice. And I don't think we're going to solve the world problem in 1.5 hours today. So what is climate change? Let's get to the definition. It's a change in the long-term climate. Climate is generally seen as something that you can measure from 30 years or onwards, and that you can see patterns developing in the climate. So it's important to make a differentiation between the weather, which is what occurs on a daily basis, and what is the climate, so the pattern, the seasonal pattern and year-to-year variation that you would see and expect to happen in a certain location. What is important to consider is that global warming is a cause of the climate change that we see today. Global warming can be defined as the increase of average temperature on the Earth. This is both including the atmospheric temperature, but also oceanic. We see that from the beginning of the last century, there is a growing dependence on fossil fuels, elimination of forests, and the expensive use of agrochemical that had an excess impact on CO2, carbon dioxide emissions in the world. The rising temperatures will continue to stimulate the melting polar ice and high altitude snowpack, which will affect global sea level, but also oceanic currents, which are the great creators of global weather and climate patterns. If you now look at this graph, and I hope you can see it all clearly on your screen, this is a graph made by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a scientific organization that consults the UN and others on scientific basis for policy making worldwide. It holds real authority. Temperatures, as been shown here in this graph, will continue to rise over the next 50 years unless we reduce it. If the status quo remains, we should be prepared for an increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, and we really have to adapt to higher temperatures. The first important requirement is to reduce the carbon dioxide emission by 45% relative to the carbon dioxide emission that was in 2010, and we have to reach that by 2030, which is less than 10 years far ahead. By 2050, we have to completely eliminate an excess of carbon emissions, and that is really showing how big the challenge is that we are facing with today. So if we go from a global overview to the situation in South Africa, what have we seen so far? There is a study by Bonado and Carey in 2008 based on really a long-term climate development pattern in the Western Cape between 1942 and 2006, is that you see that the annual temperature increase is, depending on the regions, between 0.5 degree centigrade to 1.7 centigrade. We see that there is a slightly less deviation in coastal areas compared to more inland areas where there was a sharper rise in temperature. If we look forward, what we can expect for the future is that an average temperature increase of 2% translates to up to 4% in South Africa, because it already has a very warm and dry climate. This is more towards the inland. There are expectations that in the Cape South Coast, it will not get as high, but definitely more inland, there is a fierce increase of temperature expected. If we look at what the experts say from South Africa, I have quoted Francois Engelbrecht in a recent article from the Western Cape department that has been released on the mercury rises. He says, we have to deal with much stronger heat waves and so-called multi-year droughts. So it's not only the gradual increase of temperature that can be expected, but also the variation and extremes that will, and the variability that will take place depending on the location where you are over the years to come. I think it's also important to consider how extreme the situation was in the years 2016 to 18. Here you see the total level of which with water the dams were filled, because South Africa is the 30th driest country in the world, with an average rainfall which is 40% of the world's average. So typically less than 500 millimeters per year. South Africa is also a higher user of water, so it uses 60% more water than an average country in the world, and that also depends on the dry and warm climate it has. So the really drought situation in the period from 2016 to 18 had a really huge impact on the situation in South Africa, and it's important to consider that the Western Cape water supply is really to a high extent reliant on what the dams supply in terms of water. The dams are recharged by rainfall in the catchment areas, in the mountainous catchment areas during the cooler winter months when the rain falls from May to August. And of course, the supply declines over the dry summer months from November to April. And at the end of 2017, the government announced a very like a disaster warning that something terrible would take place if the supply would fall down below 13.5% of the filling of the dams, because the situation was then between 15 and 13. So we were really close to a level 7 restriction, and that had the result that people had to queue for water, which luckily did not happen, but there were severe restrictions in place. Luckily, the situation is now that the dams are restored to normal proportions, but I think the situation had a very big impact on South Africa. So before we go into the discussion with the panelists, it's important that we really realize that we can expect South Africa to get a warmer and drier climate. We also know that if you want to produce quality grapes and quality wine, you have to consider the local climate conditions and take them into account. We also know that in South Africa, growers have lots of experience with temperature variation, water availability, appropriate plant material, and viticultural practices. But as the climate changes, it is required that these practices are adapted to a certain extent, and that's what we're going to discuss about today. So I'm going to close the presentation now. Okay, and the first person I want to talk to is Rosa. If you can please unmute yourself, Rosa.
Hello, John.
Hello, good morning. I wanted to talk to you about site and vines, obviously, which are the topics that suit you very, very well. And you have a very great on-the-ground view of what is taking place in South Africa and the different wine regions. So what do you see as the biggest manifestations of climate change in Western Cape Vineyards at the moment?
Hello, John. Firstly, I want to say hello to Evan and Cole and Kunrad, and who's the fourth panelist. And hello, everybody. It's great to be on a panel with my esteemed colleagues, especially Kunrad Skatter. I'm not a scientist, and I can only speak from practical experience in vineyards. Over the last 20 years, stretching from the west coast of Africa through up to Sutherland in the Klein Karoo, Swartland, Elgin, Stellenbosch, all over. I've been everywhere. Mine is, I have practical experience and observation in vineyards and not scientific. From what I see, dry areas are definitely getting drier, especially the west coast of South Africa. Evan will confirm that. And the cooler areas, in my estimation, I could be wrong, are getting more summer rains, which is a huge problem in itself. According to Tara Sadi, I'm very happy that you mentioned, I have the greatest respect for her research. She's from the University of Stellenbosch. Climate change impacts are highly variable in the wine growing regions of the Western Cape. Some areas, the maximum temperatures will increase, but in the minimum temperatures in other areas will decrease, which is, of course, has its own problems. It is definitely warmer from 1984 to 2015 in the Western Cape. The growing season is warming with higher temperatures in December, January, and March, and more rain in January and March. The projected increase, like you mentioned, is 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher inland and 1.5 degrees warmer in the coastal areas. That is by 2050. I'll be long gone by then, but I'm sure my colleagues will still be making wine and running around in vineyards at that time. You asked me also the question, how do grape growers adapt in the short term? I have very strong views about this, unfortunately. In the dryland areas, some farmers are moving towards less tilling between the vineyard rows. And secondly, most importantly, is building soil health with use of annual cover crops, manure, and mulching. I think soil health is going to be one of the key elements going forward in dealing with a warming climate in South Africa in future. I'll just quickly refer to soil health. Sorry, Job, but I have to. More soil health means better water holding capacity, less erosion, less compaction, more organic food for the plant available for the plant, better soil aeration, and more steady yields over the years with a better chemical analysis in the juice. Humus in the soil serves as a reservoir for plant nutrients and soil moisture. And some farmers in my area, which is Swartland, a hot and dry climate, are now actually working towards that. I have a very conservative, very staunch Swartland farmer, quite close to Evan. Herbicide and pesticide and fungicides are his friends. So he phoned me about a year ago and said, okay, Rissa, how do we go more organic? And to me, that's moving in the right direction. Some progressive farmers are also thinking of ways to harvest the water from rainfall and redirect it to their dams rather than letting it run free and cause erosion. They work with the natural contours of the land and try to limit losing topsoil by erosion through water or wind, which is a much bigger problem than we anticipate. I'll just quickly have to refer to a book that I found. Eben, you love this book, Swartland in die Sandveld. It was written in 1945 by Professor Talbot at the University of Stellenbosch. He was a professor of geology at Stellenbosch University. The most amazing book, talking about exactly what I'm talking about today. I thought I was so clever, but I am actually not that clever. He wrote about this 60 years ago, no, more than 60 years ago, 1945. And some farmers, other farmers, progressive farmers, are also considering the role of biodiversity of plant and animal species on their land. This could, having more biodiverse vineyards and not monoculture, can decrease the use of pesticides and insecticides substantially and build the natural strength of the plant and its resistance against climatic stress. And now the next question you have to ask is, what are the biggest challenges lying ahead of us? Firstly, water, water, water. Water will become even more scarce in the future. We know that. We cannot only rely, like you rightly said previously, Job, we cannot only rely on irrigation from our dams and rivers. The population is growing. There's going to be a need for more people using water and less for agriculture. We know that. We have to keep the rainwater and the moisture in the soil by more natural ways, rather than just losing everything through erosion and chemical farming. Secondly, we have to plant the correct density for each site. Dry climates means wider spacing. That's what we were taught. Although Eben would know, in some of the oldest vineyards in South Africa are planted at high density on riverbeds, maybe because they survived because of the soil underneath, but they were mostly planted to high density. So therefore, the importance of research on old vines, and I'll refer to that again. Thirdly, and that's just something I believe, there's no science for this, it's just something that I've found over the years that work in a hotter climate. We have to keep canopies in the hotter areas smaller and less vigorous to deal better with heat waves, but still maintain a sustainable crop. Therefore, less nitrogen and more balanced nutrition. That's quite controversial, I know. Lastly, definitely planting at sites that are higher and cooler, planting the correct varieties, and I believe Eben and Conrad will refer to that. But avoiding areas where summer rainfall will be a bigger problem in future.
Okay, that's a very comprehensive answer, and there are many options and many things you can discuss. What do you think about, just to talk about the site and the extreme heat spikes that are also currently hitting in the Swartland, as you told in the pre-discussion we had this morning? How can canopy management avoid sunburn, and how should people in the vineyards cope?
No, I have always believed that for most varieties, vertical shoot positioning is not an option in South Africa. I much prefer bush vines, but all cultivars or varieties can't be bush vines. I prefer bush vines because they seem to live longer. I'm not sure about that. It's just my impression, because most of our oldest vineyards in South Africa are bush vines. Now, they may be bush vines because they were planted only bush vines at that time. But still, we prune in always 1 or 2 year old wood rather than old wood, so you get less woodborne diseases. So for me, bush vines is preferable in the hotter climate with little rainfall. I'm not talking about climates that's cool and wet like Elgin or that side of the country. And also to always try for smaller canopies and a sprawl rather than a straight VSP. I know coal farms mostly, your farming has been great over the years that I visited. I had the privilege of visiting your vineyards, and that's mostly VSP, but that suits those cultivars and that site. But most sites in the hotter climates warrants more bush vines, a smaller canopy, smaller leaves that provides more shade against sunburn and seems to keep a high acidity in the grapes.
Yeah, I think also the goblet or the bush vine method is really future resistant in a dry and warming climate, because they require less rain, and they have better aeration and better, well, especially with age, better leaf to fruit ratio, I do believe. So I want to take the topic to vines, Rosa, because you're a specialist on that as well. What do you think is the importance of old vines in adapting to climate change?
You know, when we started with the Old Vine project, and Evan was with me when he started 20 odd years ago, we approached most of the existing industry bodies for support, and they honestly treated us like naughty children. You know, it's a nice idea, but please, you know, honestly. Now, so much research in locally and internationally are being done on old vines. The OIV, you know, who speaks French, Organization of International Organization for Viticulture, is putting together an international work plan on to research old vines. It's an amazing team of 25, 30 international scientists and viticulturists studying everything about old vineyards, from roots to density to vine balance to genetic diversity and cultural practices. And the Old Vine Project, headed now by Andre Morgenthal, is part of this group. It's all about sustainability in a changing climate. The word is sustainability. The viticultural questions that the Old Vine Project has been asking for years is more relevant now than ever. Why do some vineyards survive for 100 years without much missing vines, even in a really, really hot climate like the footpath that Evan Sari makes? Is it cultivation practices? Is it soil health? Is it grafting processes, which is a hot topic now? Is it wood disease, or is it the correct variety for the specific site? We don't know, but maybe we can learn that from old vineyards. What is necessary to save South African vine heritage? We've come a long way with the Old Vine Project in South Africa. A long answer to this question is we have to cultivate a culture of viticulture, a culture and a love for vines in this country rather than just growing grapes. The education and training of the people that work the land is of the utmost importance.
I think that's very clear. And if you make that statement, I think it counts. Thank you very much, Rosa. Maybe we'll come back to you with the Q&A later in the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Then I want to move on to Mr. Eben Sadi. Good morning to you too. And I want to talk to Eben about soil and about grape varieties. Not overlapping a lot with what Rosa said, although she cheated a little bit and talked about soil moisture shortly in her first introduction, but she's excused. Eben, you work in the Swartland, which is renowned for its dry and extreme climate. And of course, you have also faced extremely dry growing season, not for 1 year, as we've experienced with heat spikes in Europe in 2018 and relatively dry, but in multiple seasons. And I just wanted to pick your brains on how do you develop a long-term soil building strategy to increase soil health, soil moisture, and what are the steps you take? How do you monitor progress, and what are your expectations for the future?
Good. Yeah, I just want to say first and foremost, good morning to everybody. I think the question today is, you know, and you've said it prior, that, you know, we live in a country that's got a very low rainfall, yet we've got a very high water usage. And the reason for that is because for most regions in South Africa producing wine, there is irrigation is required. I think when you don't, I think we must discuss all terms in terms of not being able to irrigate. You know, I think if you look at South Africa and you want to talk about sustainability, I mean, the sustainable option is not to irrigate and to find ways to farm that you can get to a scenario where you don't, or if need be, where you irrigate in a very, very wise manner. In other words, the irrigation is basically 1 or 2 top-ups in a year because of climate extremities. But I think the norm where people merely irrigate because they like to see green plants and plants growing, I think that's not the potential future. And in terms of soil moisture, as Larissa has mentioned, it's very much linked to soil health. The biggest driver in soils, in terms of the management of moisture in the soil, is the component carbon. And the wonderful thing with plants is one of the, there's technical ways to do it and scientific ways, but from a very natural perspective, if you talk about carbon sequestration, which is the process of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the ground, plants are wonderful vehicles to do this. And you know what we're doing in the world is we're pumping oil out of the ground, then we make fuel out of it and we burn that fuel. But the heat can't go anywhere. So we must now go take that carbon that we've built that's in the atmosphere, we must fixate it out of the atmosphere and return it back to the earth. And for that, you use plants. So the real benefit of, building the carbon in your soil is, you're going to take all that carbon out of the atmosphere, and you, in a parallel running system, you're part of the future solution of the world. Now, the vine itself fixates carbon, but for us, a big way to do that is obviously our cover crops. I think when most people walk into a vineyard, anywhere in the world, they see the row of vines, right? But when I walk into a vineyard, I don't even see the vines, because the vines are already there. You've made the decision for 40, 60, 100 years. You've already chosen, I'm going to plant Shiraz here. You've made the decision, the plant's standing there. There's nothing you can do about that plant anymore. The plant's there. And I'm part of a study group that's also in the USA. It's more like wheat farmers and tobacco farmers, and they're farmers, farming mostly cereals and so forth. But it's a very interesting group that's working on regenerative farming. And when you look at vineyards, you must think of companion planting or cover crops. And they always say the money is between the rows. The money is not where the vines are growing, because that's been decided. It's what you do between the vines. And a vast majority of the work we're doing, and it's not just us, everybody, Rusa, all the good viticulturists, is, working out cover crop programs to bind up the maximum volume of carbon that you can. And there are plants that are better fixators of carbon, and there's plants that don't. And the big thing with building this carbon is, if you can get a soil, so the maximum you can get to in the world is 6%, okay? The carbon percentage in our soil. To give you an idea, most Cape soils where we're farming, that percentage is around 1%. If you look at a place like Burgundy, a very old place, people have been farming there for generations. And if you look at the very historic Burgundy, not the Burgundy we know today, say Burgundy in the 15, 16, and 1700s, you would have lived in your house. Under your house was all your animals. Every day you go to the vineyard, you will take all the manure out of the stables. You'll take that manure out to the vineyard, and every day you'll put it onto the next 5 or 6 vines. So in the space of a year, all the manure that was under your house or in your paddock with your animals will make its way into the vineyard. And through 300 years of farming that way, the soils in Burgundy were built to the point where a lot of soils in Burgundy is up at 5%, 5.5%, all of that. And then you get a new generation after the Second World War. We're starting to use herbicides. We're starting to use normal conventional farming. And we say, okay, now we're going to, and then you had 40, 50 years of farming like that. And now we say, no herbicides, that's the way forward. But in a paradoxical way, what's happened now in Burgundy, when you till the soil all the time, when you're plowing all the time, every time you plow the soil, you burn the carbon in the soil. Because what happens is you move the soil around, all organic processes starts again, and because the soil wants to reset the equilibrium it had. So you're plowing, you start to have carbon being burned in the soil. So not using herbicides or not using herbicides almost in a paradoxical way preserve the carbon in the soil. And now we're plowing so much, now we're burning all the carbon again. So what are we going to do? Because we can't use herbicides for obvious reasons because of the issues that we have from that in the soils. And we can't plow all the time. And the real answer is cover crops,
Can you give some examples of cover crops that do really well for you in the vineyard?
It's really soil dependent. The first objective with planting cover crops is, you don't get something like a weed. I always say, you only have desirable plants in undesirable places. It's like grass growing in a vineyard. Grass is great when you farm cattle, but if you're going to have a very competitive grass growing in your vineyard that doesn't have irrigation, that has already a lot of stress, that's not a good idea. So it's a desirable plant, it's just growing in an undesirable place. So what you must do is you must plant plants that can compete with the undesirable plants, so that when your cover crop strategy is fulfilled, you sit with a greater environment. So if you've got soils that's completely nitrogen deprived, it's good to plant legumes, be it lupins, faba beans, plants that can put nitrogen back in your soil. If you've got soils, we've got soils here in the Swartland, they're weak in nitrogen, but they're also weak in moisture. But nitrogen we can address by carrying in compost and bringing in chicken manure and all those things. But the biggest thing today with cover crops we're farming in the Swartland is we're trying to we'll grow plants that give a lot of material, a lot of fiber, a lot of cellulose, plants that gives a lot of material. And then in spring, we will roll that cover crop flat to try and create a thick carpet. Now, the carpet during the summer does reduce from walking on the cover crop, the tractors driving on the cover crop, spray pumps being pulled behind the tractor. But you've got essentially this carpet that's getting compacted. But what's happening with this cover crop that's on that soil? First of all, that cover crop and that's the thing that very few people discuss. The Cape's got some of the biggest wind flow patterns in the growing season. We've got that deadly southeasterly. I remember the first time I went to the round, I talked about the Mistral and the Tramontana in the south. And I woke up one morning and the guys were like complaining, all the French guys, and it was like what was for me like a breeze blowing. And then they said that was the Mistral. And I said, is this the Mistral? You must come to the Cape and see a real wind. When the southeast blows, it exponentially increases the evapotranspiration out of the soils. But by having that carpet, you keep it in. With having that carpet of fiber, you keep the solar radiation off the ground. So you also keep the dehydration of the soils. You limit that. And the other thing about having a big and good cover crop or cover on your vineyard is obviously you homogenize the soil temperature, that you don't have this big soil temperature shifts. And when you want to create a great soil environment where you've got great organic material with a great biolife, if you go outside 32 degrees in temperature, and we've done trials with probes with soils that was covered and soils that was not covered. With our cover crop soils, the biggest shift we saw in the topsoil in the first 30 centimeters was 7 degrees from max to low. With no cover crops, we saw shifts of 24 degrees. No microlife will live there because the organisms can't handle that shift. So it's about creating this environment where you can capture the water in winter. And with your soil practices in winter. For me, the most important time of the year is now, not the harvest. You can do nothing in harvest. You had 11 months to farm. If you haven't farmed in 11 months, you must make peace with the wines that you've got. Now you must work. You've got now 3 weeks, hopefully, before the first rains arrive. Your strategies for your cover crop soil preparations, all of that is the maximum. And the thing is, and I'll try and simplify it, what you're trying to do, instead of building a dam at the bottom of the valley, filling it with with water in winter, and pumping the water to your vineyard, you're trying to create a dam inside the soil that can catch all the water, manage and store it there, and you don't need to pump anything anywhere. It's like creating billions of dams everywhere on your farm, and to use the full square metrics of your farming unit to capture that moisture. And that's, for me, the way forward to find a sustainable future. And then,
no, I think the point is very valid what you make, that the action is between the rows, and I think we could listen to a whole lecture on soil from you all day, and I think it's too limited to discuss everything, Eben. But I also want to touch upon the grape varieties with you, because I think it's a very topical issue that you address, and you've made a lot of stride over the last few years of introducing new grape varieties into your vineyards, and also in vineyards of growers, as I understand. So how do you start with new varieties in South Africa, and how do you select the appropriate vineyard to plant these new varieties, and what do you think is the most successful varieties you're going to hopefully produce in the coming years with climate change?
I think it's obviously very regional dependent, so I'll address the question from a Swartland specific.
Yeah, please do.
I think the reason the Swartland is in South Africa is so that we can suffer and then the others can learn from us. Because it's at such a critical point, the drought, the only place that's more drought affected than the Swartland is the Olifantsrivier area up in the Citrusdal Mountains. But from a Swartland perspective, obviously, you get two types of grape varieties. You get isohydric and anisohydric. And isohydric varieties, by definition, are varieties that's just better adapted to hydric stress. So I'll give you a couple of good examples. If you plant grapes, for example, like Assyrtiko, Criollo, Catarato, Cinsault Blanc, Picapool, they are vastly better adapted to drought conditions as opposed to Sauvignon Blanc. So, yes, there's great areas in South Africa for Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, Constantia and Elgin and those areas that's got higher natural rainfall and all of that. But it wouldn't make sense to plant a grape like Sauvignon Blanc in the Swartland. First of all, climatically, the grape wouldn't respond well. And secondly, it will have excessive water usage. So those other, the pre-mentioned grape varieties will work much better. For red wines, for red grapes, if you plant Grenache, or you plant Carian, or you plant Alicante Bouschet, or the other name, Garnacha Tintorera, Cunoise, if you plant Agriogitica from Greece, the Portuguese grapes like Trincadeira, Tinta Francesa, Tinta Amarela, if you plant grapes like Negra Amaro, Aglianico, these varieties are simply better adapted to the hydric stress. And one interesting thing that's dawned upon me now, with having planted a lot of these varieties, and now starting to observe the grapes and making like micro batches of wine out of these varieties is, and this is just very, very generalized. So, I mean, there's always going to be exception, but most of the grape varieties that's extremely well adapted to heat has got bigger bunches and bigger berries. You know, your varieties with small leaves, small berries, small bunches, they don't have the reserve and all of that. And so a lot of these varieties we've planted, we've seen bigger bunches, bigger berries, but you know, we're not trying to make pitch black wine here that must score 100 points. We're trying to produce grapes that can sustainably be grown in our environment, producing grapes that can give an honest reflection of what our soils are about and capture the fruit and aromatics of what our climatology is about. So, and these grapes have proven to do better. And you know, then there's the whole development of in the winery around these varieties and trying to figure out how they work. But we've planted, I think, almost 24 new varieties. So we're observing.
Have you experimented also with drought-resistant rootstocks or variations to see how that will work out in the future?
Yeah, South Africa's rootstocks from the outset, you know, we've had from the time of Pancrats and you know, South Africa is an incredible country in terms of the historic intellect that we've had. We've had amazing generations before us that built such strong database and detail on things. You know, just the rootstock development in South Africa and the research that was done over the last 80 years, it's groundbreaking. You know, it's countries like America and Australia but country miles away from our research on rootstock. So I think from a rootstock perspective, we're very well positioned, you know, and be it Richter 99 or 110 or Rougerie, very well adapted to drought, and even the crossing from Stellenbosch, the 8 4-7, the US, it's called Afstrep 7. Very, very good. But so we've got good rootstocks. I think there's a lot of good work going on at the moment. I just think the problem is it's still easier to sell a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and a bottle of Merlot. And so people will keep on planting Merlot and Sauvignon Blanc, even though I think there's a lot of areas where it shouldn't be planted simply because of the volume of water that's going to be needed to be carried to those vineyards. So,
so rather grow grapes that belong rather than what the market demands.
Don't plant what sells, plant what belongs. And but it is changing, you know, in South Africa. And the good thing that's happening in South Africa now is we're starting to have regional identity. I think it's safe to say Robertson, good on Chardonnay, good on classic wines, you know, the Yamana Valley with the Pinot and the Chardonnays there climatically, Constantia's getting defined, Swartland's getting defined. And I think things are going in the right direction, which is good.
Thank you very much, Eben, for your contribution and clarification on these points. I think it's very exciting that you have such a vast variety of grapes planted, because there was a big article in Nature, I think in 2018, which said that in a lot of countries there is close to only 1% of grape varieties being planted or dominating the market for 70 to 80%. And we should maybe look for a greater variation in grape varieties that belong to places like the Swartland and with a Mediterranean or warmer climate. So I think it's very important.
We even have a variety that's coming back now. I mean, you can obviously with Carl you can speak because he's got a greater authority, you know, but the importance of bringing a grape like Pontac back, you know. So yeah, Carl can touch on that, but I mean Hartenberg and the history with the grape. I was lucky to get some of their buds, so we're planting Pontac this year, and I'm not planting 100 hectares, but I'm planting a little bit, you know, and I can't wait to see what the grape looks like. I've been looking at the grape for 20 years in photos. I don't want to look at another photo. I want to have the actual bunch. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very nice bridge to the next speaker, Carl. I want to talk to you about climate change and winemaking and farm management. But first, I want to hear about the historical importance of Pontac, the terroir that you farmed, I think, until 2005 or 2004. And then you left the plot because of the disease. But what is the significance and the relation between Hartenberg and Pontac?
Good morning to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity, Job and Woza. Yeah, Pontac is part of forgotten Cape wine history in a way, but we found very interesting archival notes referring to the shipment of Pontac in barrels from the Cape, from Constantia, to the UK in 1770 already. So we know this grape seems to have existed a very long time ago, but it completely disappeared. There is a school of thought that other than the famous Constantia dessert wine, the white wine, that there was a red Constantia. More and more there's this thinking. And because Pontac is only one of, I think, about 3 tine terroirs, you squeeze the berry, the juice is red, which is unusual. There was a theory that because of the intensity of color, that it may have been one of the extinct Constantia red desserts. So I know Groot Constantia and somebody else attempted to plant it, but I can just say to Eben, I made wine from Pontac for about 8 years. It's a tough little grape. It's if you sneeze, it rots. So it's something that's very it's a bit like Grenache in a growing conditions. It's sensitive to mildew, to lots of other things. It has very tight, small bunches, small berries, and it's a very challenging grape, but it produces something which can't be described. I would describe it as a Bordeaux blend, because it seems to encompass elements of Cabernet and Merlot and pretty much everything else from Bordeaux. Very complex. It has tannat type tannins in its youth. So I bottled the last vintage of Hartenberg Pontac in 2000, well, the 2000 vintage. And if you open bottles of that, it's a bit like tannat. It's just going to live forever. It makes a comeback in the 1920s, I think. Professor Orfer experimented with its use possibly for Cape port production. At the time was a very big thing. South Africa produced the biggest quantity of port style wine at one time in the Southern Hemisphere. And but it develops a characteristic where the color evidently will drop out at some point, or it'll lighten, and that's obviously not what you want for a vintage port. So we inherited a vineyard planted in the 1960s, a bush vine vineyard. It's an amazing grape. It's challenging, but I think very satisfying. And it took me all of 15 years to get new material, to get material cleaned up by the Department of Agriculture. And yes, happily we planted a year or 2 ago. We've planted, and I've held the site for almost 15 years, and so we know where we wanted to plant it, and it's going to be developed to bush vine like the original vineyard, and it'll hopefully make a good comeback.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see the comeback of Pontac and compare it with Eben's wine in the future.
Mm.
I also wanted to touch your brain on the consequence of grape chemistry with climate change, Carl, because you have a huge experience at working at one estate, which is quite rare in the Cape. So with climate change, you could expect elevated fruit sugars, lower acid concentration, especially malic acid, lower anthocyanins, methoxyperazine levels. And as Dr. Gregory Jones said in a Master of Wine seminar on climate change, vines are resilient, but as they adapt, they change. And as such, the resulting wines should not be expected to be the same in the future, which I think is a very interesting line of thought. So what are you seeing as an impact of climate change and the winemaking practices of today?
Yeah, I think firstly, just if one looks at the grape composition, we know that hotter vintages, in hotter climatic regions where grapes are grown. We know at elevated levels of picking ripeness that the composition of the sugars in the grape berry change. And essentially, the grape berry sugar is what we call a monosaccharide. It's glucose, and it's easily used. It's easily metabolized by the yeast. There are lesser sugars in the grape, which are not really of any practical, I'd say, use or problematic. But once we go to warmer areas, once we have hotter vintages, and of course these elevated sugars, then the composition changes. We get a sugar called fructose, which is a disaccharide sugar. It's more difficult to metabolize. So literally all yeast, that whether they be wild yeast or whether they be cultivated yeast, show preference for glucose. And so what you've been seeing in the last decade or more is that winemakers are preemptively analyzing for fructose, which was unheard of 20, 30 years ago. And it's because, I think, partly driven by consumer demand, where demand for, let's say, most red wines, we find that there's a strong preference for fruit-driven wines, clean berry fruits, primary fruit stylistically. And I think a greater criticism of any green, leafy, tomato leaf, forest floor type characters. I mean, in extreme cases, I know it's been described as burnt rubber, this character. And in an effort to combat that and to, in a way, subtly change the direction of style in wine, winemakers have picked riper. Not just have they picked riper, they've manipulated the canopy. We know that greater light intensity reduces the levels of things like methoxypyrazine and some of the other elements that cause greenness or perceived sensation of greenness on wine. So I think my colleague Rosa touched on canopy. I think I should just say yes, and I've noticed changes, and she reminded me that one of the really important changes is canopy. Typically in South Africa, we planted in a north-south row direction if they were trellis vineyards, and Conrad will probably speak about it later, but that's changed dramatically because of the solar tracking technology that's available, keeping grapes out of the sun. In a normal Cape vintage, if grapes at the perpendicular, at the apex of the sun between 11 and 1, if it gets sun on the grapes directly, they'll burn to raisin within a few days. So the canopies have changed, the density of the canopies have changed, the way they manipulate affects the grape composition. So it's, I think what I attended an amazing seminar on global warming, climate change way back in 2007 in Bordeaux. And it is actually the first time I'd heard some of these terms that we're discussing. And what struck me was that unfortunately there is no solution to this. I call it a pandemic that's just never going to go away. This pandemic, the only way you could survive as a business, as a grower, as a farmer, is to adapt. And I guess a lot of what we'll be talking about is adapting. Eben touched on a lot of the things that can be done. I think South Africa is fortunate in that we have an extremely, I'd say, informed, hungry for information, forward-thinking industry. There's an Afrikaans saying which refers to there's strength in unity. I'm always encouraged by the cooperation between producers and between essentially competitors, because South Africans generally have a more outward-looking approach to markets and to competition than any other country that I can think of in wine. And I think this is to our great advantage. But just back to the topic, perhaps. I think what we've also seen is that we get what we call nutrient depleted mass. So typically where 20, 30 years ago, you could either allow a spontaneous fermentation or inoculate a fermentation, what we now see is we're needing to supplement nutrition for the vine. I mean, the vine's primary engine, the yeast's primary engine is nitrogen, and the nitrogen is added. It's obviously controlled, there are limits, but we're also seeing things like vitamins and other supplements that are added that are now deemed necessary for a healthy fermentation. It is so that many producers perhaps would be able to ferment without, but there's no doubt that when you pick riper and you pick at higher sugars, you're running at higher alcohols, then you have a depleted must. So it's extremely important.
That's a risk for the future, definitely.
Yeah.
I also wanted to discuss with you a little bit of farm management, because I think Hartenberg, with its extensive wetlands, is really a pioneer in Stellenbosch for biodiversity and how you work with waste and water recycling. I think it's very worthwhile to share your thoughts about that and how you work at Hartenberg for a couple of minutes, Carl.
Sure. I think as a few speakers have identified, and I agree, water and temperature are the big threats for the Cape future. But back in 2007, they already predicted the western seaboard of every continent in the southern hemisphere will become warmer and drier. So we've had that information for decades, as it were. And this holds true. And I think conservation of water, absolutely essential for what we need to do. If I think, Eben spoke about different varieties, different abilities to preserve water. If I think back 30 years, in Stellenbosch, produced more Pinot Noir for red wine than somebody like the Himmelenade and Hermanus and the Overberg. And today, you virtually cannot find Pinot Noir made for red wine in this area. I think there are 3 or 4 producers left. There was a reference to Sauvignon Blanc. Yes, Sauvignon Blanc and Merlot. They're already migrating to areas outside of the traditional areas. At Hartenberg, we've started off with Sauvignon Blanc, and 30 years later, we've just grafted over some of our last Sauvignon Blanc, because I think Sauvignon Blanc today in the warming climate needs to be within sight of the ocean or at altitude, or on a big southern slope preferably with deep soils, deep cool soils. I should just say that at Hartenberg, we're very fortunate that we have an equivalent hectarage of land in conservation when weighed up against what we cultivate. So we have about 80 hectares of vineyard and almost 70 hectares of indigenous wetland. So it took about 7 years to clear the wetland of aliens. Aliens in
Alien
our country,
vegetation, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. Right. Alien vegetation takes up 30% of South Africa's annual rainfall. The government is quite proactive. They have different programs which not just generate employment, but a lot of hand cleaning of catchment areas that are clogged up with really bad alien vegetation. I think wetlands are super important because they're nature's filters. They clean water, but that exact characteristic is the tool that we use to develop a technique almost 15 years ago with an Austrian hydrologist called Erich Schmalgruber, and he pioneered this thinking and this technique. But essentially, it means that no water ever leaves Hartenberg. And what does this mean? Well, Hartenberg, like many Cape farms, exists where it is because it was where water was found. So we're using 7 springs up in the heart of the mountain, Hartenberg, which are over 400 years old. And we're off the grid as far as water goes. We're not on any mains. Our drinking water is very old, deep artesian water. And from the outset, we've been extremely conscious about the responsible use. We find that people irrigate vineyards from artesian water. Artesian water in the last 5 to 7 years with the drought, when your annual rainfall decreases, keeping in mind that only 2 to 3% of annual rainfall makes it down to artesian water, then the boreholes and all the wells start to drop too. So it's not uncommon, certainly in the drought, where we hear stories of farmers they run out of water because the wells have dried up, or they're having to drill deeper to get the same water. So it's something that we're extremely conscious of. And certainly here, we have a beautiful little restaurant and a kitchen and a tasting room, and we have people living on the farm. And that water, that potable water, is used only for that. Unfortunately, in South Africa, all water that leaves the tap is used pretty much for anything, which is a real pity. I think the Israelis, we may not like their politics, but they recycle 96% of all water. And they have 2 different grids of grey water and potable water. And that would be the dream, I think.
No, and I think after the 3-year drought, I think the realization in the wine industry has become more intense and more severe, and people are much more aware of it, even more so than before, about the importance of water. And I think you do a great job at Hartenberg in preserving that, and with the help of the extensive wetlands. And I think we maybe come back later on in the Q&A, Carl, about other biodiversity initiatives that you employ in Hartenberg, which are really leading by example, I think. So next up, I want to talk with Konrad Schutte for the final 2 topics on new techniques and tools that grape growers and wineries can use, but also a future focus maybe of research projects. So Konrad, I'm really looking forward to what are the consultation services that you do on VinPro? Maybe explain a little bit about that, and what you see is in much demand by growers, and what you think is the way forward.
Yes, thank you, Job, and good morning to all the listeners. And it's nice to see my colleagues as well. Just after harvest, usually this time of the year, you drive past each other in the bucky, but you do not have time to have a nice sit down and a cup of coffee and exchange ideas. So hello to you guys as well. Yes, Job, so I think you asked me to quickly elaborate on better innovative tools, a bit of weather forecasting, and then quickly touch on knowledge transfer within the industry as well. So just in terms of 15 minutes, it's quite a broad topic to cover, so I'm just going to touch on them really briefly. But firstly, I will just have a look at the wine tech projects that's currently running in the country. Then I'll touch on Vineyards of the Future, which is the Gen Z project in South Africa. And I can quickly maybe touch on knowledge transfer. But if we go to the wine tech flagship projects, maybe for the people that's not 100% up to date with wine tech. Wine tech is a business unit funded by levies paid by wine grape producers. So currently they run about 68 projects within the country. I'm only going to speak to you on 3 of their flagship projects, which is directly correlated with climate change. So the first one is called TerraClim. So this is actually a project that originated from an older project that WineTech funded, where they integrated remote sensing and climate and grapevine responses over 6 localities over a 4-year period. So in the results of that study, they indicated that the grapevine is responding to climate change through altered phenology, growth, and ripening responses. So then they decided to fund this online spatial decision support system specifically created for the wine industry. So it provides producers with climate and terrain information all the way down to a farm and a block level. So I think in terms of site selections, the producers are also given the necessary tools to adapt to climate change. And if you ask me really to quickly identify 1 or 2 things on the vineyard side that I think is critical to adapt to climate change, I think site selection is absolutely critical. You know, we have really dry areas, and then you can go up to Elgin where we have 1,200 millimeters, which obviously poses other risks in terms of rot, etc. But site selection is absolutely critical, and even on one vineyard site, there could be various options to plant on one farm, which is really nice to have this tool. So currently, this is still in a pilot phase. They will complete it within the Western Cape area. Currently, they have hourly and daily and monthly temperature data available on a block level. But yeah, I think it's a really nice informative system and a decision support to our producers to decide where to plant vineyards. In terms of water efficiency, there's a nice practical trial going on. You know, it is based in climatically different regions. So one of these trials are in Stellenbosch, Breedekloof, and then Olifantsrivier as well. So the producer will actually keep on irrigating as usual in his vineyards, and then we have researchers coming in as well, and they see what they can do on the irrigation side. So they irrigate at higher or lower stress levels. And interestingly enough, within the past season in the Olifant River, I think we all know that the Olifant River was hit really hard by the drought. If you compare the readings from the researchers to those of the commercial producers, in a block of Shiraz, we could actually ripen up the same crop with less amount of water on the researcher side, and they could also ripen up the crop earlier. So we use less water, and we achieve the desirable sugar level over there at an earlier stage, which is quite interesting. I will have to go up there and see exactly how they did that, but it's just an indication that we can learn from the researchers as well. In terms of a breeding program, so WineTech is also running a breeding program. Obviously, this is a longer-term project. So the main objective of this project is to develop a new cultivar, which will cultivars, which will produce sustainable yield and wine quality, while they are partially resistant to powdery mildew, downy mildew, and botrytis under South African conditions. Now that's a big dream to have, but they are putting this together.
You're talking about hybrid varieties, I understand?
It's a breeding program, so not necessarily hybrids. It's a breeding program. So the objective would be to identify potential parents with disease tolerance, then obviously making the crosses, developing and establishing the seedlings in tunnels, and then maybe putting the older plants into vineyards, and then also get some potential parents from overseas countries if they have these suitable qualities. So that, I think that would give South Africa a competitive advantage above other countries, if you can call this variety your own. I think we are all aware of Pinotage, that was crossed in 1932, and it's quite a bigger part of the production in South Africa at this stage. But I think if you go to most countries in the EU, they are looking into their own varieties. This could be something that we should keep our eye on in the environment. So that's the WineTech flagship projects. Yep. I'm quickly going to hop over to a more practical project, and the reason why I say more practical, usually when you speak about these projects, the flagship projects that's run by industry, if you go to a producer, they will say, yeah, Conrad, it's really nice, but you did these trials in Stellenbosch. I'm sitting in the Swartland or Robertson or Worcester, so the climate is different. And I think Eben also alluded to regional identity as well as coal. And I think this project is put in place to take into account those regional differences. So it's a Vineyard of the Future project called Gen Z. So in that specific project, we identify grower priorities and challenges, and then we also implement research findings and technology within grower demonstration days. So it's an on-farm demonstration of old practice and then also new farming innovations. So it could be anything from cover crops, which Eben also spoke about, water management carried out in commercial vineyards, like I said, which happen up in the Olifant River. Then we also have different rootstock trials, different cultivar demos, and then also demonstration of new techniques, like new implements, digital application and tools and sensors. So the mission and the vision of this project is really to exchange knowledge and information and hopefully the producers will go back to their own properties, adopting these new practices, making them more sustainable and profitable in the future. So currently we have about 50 different demos in the different wine growing regions. I remember at Hartenberg, we did a different rootstock, 14 different rootstocks on the Sauvignon Blanc you spoke about. Example at Kanonkop, we're looking at 10 different clones of Cabernet, which would give them an answer of a wine goal on a specific site and a specific soil in terms of Cabernet clone, which is really nice to have. And then that could typically be something like row direction trials as well that we spoke about earlier. So that really depends on the need from the producers in that specific region, and we plant those plots in the vineyards over there. Just maybe to end off the vineyards of the future, I don't think we can speak about the future if we don't touch on people as well. So at Stellenbosch University, we liaised with Stellenbosch and we planted 4 to 5 hectares of training vineyards for the viticulture and oenology students at Stellenbosch University. We are actually unveiling or launching the project on this Friday to the media. But in those vineyards, we have different trailer systems. So we have split canopies, we have bush vine. There was quite a bit of talk about bush vine, smaller canopies by previous speakers as well. We have vertical shoot positioning, sprawling canopies, mechanized canopies. And we also have irrigation trials, different cultivars on 2 different rootstocks irrigated at different regimes. We have a winemaking block with 19 different cultivars. We have a pruning block with 11 different pruning systems. And then also a cultivar collection block with about 88 different cultivars. So, you know, if you placed in such an environment at a university and you are exposed to these nice vignettes showing you all the different training systems, that would really help training the future leaders.
Well, that's actually quite an impressive list of projects that you're doing. If I see at the future focus, and I refer to an article by Professor Kees van Leeuwen from Bordeaux University. So he says there are actually 2 options. So you either look for new regions that have the cooling influence, maybe if you refer to South Africa, so that are in closer proximity to the ocean, or maybe altitude. So they have a cooling influence to stay to the current way of the window of full ripening, or you can look for alternatives in places where you currently farm, and maybe the latter is the best option because you have the infrastructure there, you have already the knowledge, you have the knowledge about the soil, about the day's length, seasonal patterns that stay in place. So my question for you, Conrad, is how do you refer to where do you see the importance of maybe developing new regions versus trying to adapt it in established regions in South Africa?
Thank you for the difficult question. Yeah, I think if we track that back to the wine tech project called TerraClim, that's exactly what that project will give you. So you can go online, and if you look at the rain analysis, that will give you, mean February temperatures, where you can exactly look at the February temperatures, which our technical people usually like to have a look at, because that's at the end of the ripening period for most cultivars or in harvest season. So cultivars like Sauvignon Blanc, don't like a lot of heat. So the rain analysis will give you lots of answers. But if you just look at the micro level, I alluded to Elgin a bit earlier. It's about 2 to 3 degrees cooler than Stellenbosch. We get 1,100 millimeters of rain over there. And the guys have a lot of water. The soils have a bigger clay content, and they do retain the water better over there. So I think it's, in terms of the future, it might be easier to grow wine grapes over there. I think Evan said the guys struggle up in the Swartland, and then the rest of the industry learn lessons from them. But that's exactly why there's other initiatives like cover crops and increasing the carbon content in the soil in other wine growing regions. So you have to look at a regional specific site. And yes, we do look at interesting new regions. I mean, up in the Eastern Cape, guys are planting vineyards. There's some vineyard plantings up in Natal, etc. And they come along with challenges as well. Most of them are involved, summer rainfall. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you a good indication. But I'm a guy that likes experimentation, and I've been in vineyards where you walk into the vineyard in the winter month and you're knee deep in snow, and then on the other hand you walk into the Namib desert and there's vineyard plantings over there as well. So I like to see what can happen in the different wine growing regions and get a certain wine quality from interesting sites.
Exactly. So hedging your bets and looking at both the perspectives equally, I think. Okay, now I think it's time to look at the Q&A, and Sarah was so kind to forward some questions for me. And my first question is for Rosa. So I come back to where we started. It's a question from Patrick Delaert. Do you think the risk exists that in the future certain regions, parts of the world, or maybe South Africa, it will become impossible to grow grapes and make wine? What is your future perspective on that?
Well, I can only speak about South Africa because this is my country and my experience lies here. I do think some areas are going to become unfarmable for vineyards. If you don't have less than 300, 250 millimeters of rain, it's almost impossible to grow grapes. We know that. But like Konrad touched on that, there are new areas coming. I believe in going higher and going to the mountains, Pietermaritzkloof Mountain, Pieterberg Mountain, Ceres Mountains. There's vast areas that can be planted. That's much cooler with good soils. The only problem is the guys make so much money from farming citrus or soft fruits there that they don't want to plant vineyards, but we're trying to convince them.
Very good. And then I've also got a question for Eben from Richard Bamfield. He says, I realize it's probably too early to say for you, Eben, but could the new varieties you have planted have bigger bunches and grape because they are young and have received a lot of attention and more water by maybe irrigation or hand irrigation? Might grape and bunch size decrease as the vines get older? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think the actual bunch size and the grape size doesn't really change. It's the number of bunches. Your crop level is determined more so by the number of bunches than anything else. So I think, for me, it's, the bunch size, all of that's not the concern. That's, that's the biggest immediate thing between old vines and young vines. Young vineyards generally is vastly expanding their root zone system. They're growing their vegetative cycle at the top, developing arms and shoots and all of that. And the balance in young vines often disproportionate, and a young vine just needs a much better jockey. Old vines are great for people that want to take a little bit of a back seat, because old vine is just by nature growing in a kind of a better equilibrium. But the yield on young vineyards, if you manage it, you can make extraordinary wine from young vineyards. It's not, there's no absolutes. It's just old vineyards is just easier because the work's been done by the plant and not by the management for most. So yeah, a bigger berry simply has more water that is taken up when you look at when the berries expand, and that it's still quite an early part of the season. It's sort of your December months here, which is the summer months. And you haven't yet started going into the end of summer and fall for harvesting. So, if you can store that moisture up, that's also a place for the vine where it will go collect moisture, is the bunches. And obviously, if you have too much crop and too much hydric stress, what will happen is those berries will dehydrate and start to shrivel up and everything. And obviously, you won't want to pick it there unless you want to make a lot of Amarone.
Maybe link a question from Victoria Mason to what you're currently saying, Eben, is that you target organic matter percentage. Are you working towards that to build up the soils and optimize soil water retention? Or is it something that you look as a vineyard sites independently? Or what?
No, it's the primary target is the carbon load in the soil. And it's an expensive exercise because it involves moving mass. You can't build carbon with nothing. You need a lot of plants. So our cover crops we sow where people might sow 60 kilograms of lupins, we'll sow 80. If it's 100 of some cereals, we'll sow 140. So we put a lot of plants down, but then we also feed those plants. You can't, we're farming our cover crops as hard as we farm our in winter, we farm to the same extent as the summer with the vines. Yeah. You've got two opportunities in a year, and you must use both maximum.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your answers. I think we have to round up to be in time, and that's why I want to ask everybody, each of the panelists, to provide in one or two answers, 2 sentences, what you think is the take-home message for the viewers on the topic that we discussed. So I want to start with Rosa. Maybe you can.
I just want to say 2 things. I'm so happy to hear the work that's been done by Vinpro. Like Carl said, forward-thinking. What was your comment? Carl, forward-thinking people in this country. It's amazing. We have to give credit to Nico Spreet, who used to be he's now retired, unfortunately. He's the one that imported all these new varieties into South Africa 15 years ago. He had the foresight and the vision to actually import these varieties, clean them up, and now they're available for people. That's the one thing. The other thing is, whatever you do, go more green.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Okay, Eben, I want to ask you, what is the take-home message for the viewers?
No, I just think that people must be proactive. You can't wait for global warming. By the time you're going to wake up, it's going to be too late. Most things that's going to address global warming issues are strategies that takes a long time. And as long as the strategy is on paper, it's useless. It needs to happen. You must make it work.
You have to act now. Okay, thank you very much, Eben. Carl, do you have a message?
Yeah, it's I think, as I mentioned earlier, climate change is inevitable. It's existed for aeons. But what we're dealing with is not climate change. It's forced climate change, and this is caused by global warming. And unless we as citizens of every country convince our leadership eventually that there's still people that don't believe in the concept. We need to convince. And we need to, as a global citizenship, we need to believe the concept. And then I think the key word, and this is the takeaway from me, is innovation. Is that humans are very inventive. If we're going to Mars shortly, I'm sure we can find innovative ways to solve this challenge too. In 2007, at that conference, a professor from Cornell University said, if everybody stopped global warming, if you stopped emissions overnight and we could halt global warming immediately, the effect of that would only be seen 50 years down the line. And so what the other keyword other than innovation is evolution. And evolution is change, which is able to keep up with the speed of change. And that's where if we can reduce the speed of change, we can reduce things like species loss.
You can make a difference. Okay, thank you very much, Carl. And for you, Conrad, I think innovation sounds like a very hot topic for you.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of Jack Welch, which was the former CEO of General Electric, and I think it's similar to Carl's message, but he said when the rate of change outside an organization exceeds the rate of change inside, it's the end of that organization. And I think if you look at the panel members over here, most of them quoted books. They're regularly on talks, and they listen and they implement. So I think it's good to adopt and change because that will keep you ahead of the pack. That's my message.
Okay, thank you very much, Conrad. And as a closing statement, I want to say that the climate situation is urgent, as we have all seen, and it's very real, as evidenced by all the speakers. And we need to stop global warming. But in doing so, please keep calm and enjoy a glass of wine, preferably from South Africa when you can. Up to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Job. That was a great closing. I'd like to thank Job for your time. That was a great presentation, and thanks for keeping everyone in the time slot. And thank you very much to our panelists. Your contribution was invaluable, and it's wonderful to see the work happening in South Africa. A big thank you to Westgrow for the sponsorship to make today possible. I think we all learned something today. There were some great questions in the question box. Unfortunately, we couldn't get round to answering all of them live, but we'll try and answer most of them via email, or you're also free to send us an email with your question. And then just to say that today's recording will be available on our YouTube channel, Wines of South Africa, if anyone would like to rewatch a part of today's session. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today, for being interested in South Africa, and for your ongoing support. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. Bye.